Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. We're diving into Algeria today. Seems like a lot of you are interested in learning more about this North African nation.
Yeah, and we've got a ton of material to dig through. Algeria's history is, well, it's immense.
Definitely not a quick weekend read, but that's why we're here, to try and make sense of it all.
Right. Algeria's story is, well, it's one of those places where you've got these ancient empires clashing and blending and a resilient people.
So it's a lot more than just memorizing names and dates, right?
Exactly. It's geography, culture, you name it, all woven together.
I like that woven together. Even geographically, it's a tapestry, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got that Mediterranean coastline, right? And then the Atlas Mountains.
Right.
And then it just kind of gives way to this, well, to the Sahara Desert.
Wow. So geographically, you're already talking about a land of extremes.
Huge contrasts. And all that plays into, well, into the history of the region in a big way.
Okay, so where do we even begin with a story this big?
Well, we've got to start with the Berbers, right?
The Berbers. Now, they're the indigenous people of North Africa, is that right?
Exactly. And their history, well, it goes way back, even before the Romans, even before the Arabs.
Wow.
They were really the foundation of a lot of North African culture.
So who were the Berbers? Were they a single unified group? Or
Well, not exactly. More like a collection of different tribes and communities.
Okay.
Each with their own language, their own customs, their own way of doing things.
Got it.
But they were known for their resilience, their adaptability, and they were really connected to the land.
So like a mosaic of cultures,
Yeah.
all kind of tied together by this shared Berber heritage.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay. But I bet there were still power struggles, right?
Yeah.
Rivalries.
Oh, of course. I mean, just like anywhere else.
Right. Makes sense.
But one of the most fascinating Berber kingdoms was Numidia.
Numidia. Okay.
And they had this king, King Massinissa, and he was pretty clever. He managed to unify a bunch of different Numidian tribes.
So he was a unifier.
Yeah, very much so. And he even formed an alliance, believe it or not, with Rome.
With Rome. Wow. That's playing a dangerous game, isn't it? Aligning yourself with a rising power like Rome.
It was a risky move, for sure. But Massinissa, he was smart. He knew Rome was going to be a major player.
Right.
And he used that alliance, to expand his own power and keep Numidia independent. At least for a while.
Okay, so sometimes you got to side with the big guy to survive. But didn't things get a little messy after Massinissa?
Yeah. His successors weren't all as willing to play nice with Rome. You had King Jugurtha.
Jugurtha. Okay. What's his story?
Well, he was a bit more rebellious than his grandfather. He saw how Rome was expanding.
Right, taking over.
Exactly, taking over Berberland. And he decided to fight back.
That's brave. Taking on the mighty Roman Empire. What was he thinking?
Well, he knew the terrain, right? He was a skilled strategist.
Yeah.
And he had the support of a lot of Berbers who weren't happy with Rome.
Yeah, he probably didn't want to be part of the Roman Empire.
No, not really. And for a while, he was actually pretty successful.
Really? So for a time, he was holding them off.
Yeah. But the Romans, they were relentless, right? They used their military might and they played politics.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. Jugurtha ended up being betrayed by his allies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he was captured, taken back to Rome in chains.
Sounds rough.
The Romans, they made an example of him.
What do you mean?
They paraded him through the streets during one of their triumphs.
One of those big, victory parades.
Yeah. To show off their power, humiliate their enemies, and then they executed him.
That's cold.
It was 104 BC.
So that's the end of Jugurtha. What happens to Algeria then? Does it just become another part of Rome?
Pretty much. It was gradually Romanized.
The Romanized, okay.
But the Berbers, they didn't just disappear,
I mean, they were there for centuries, right?
Exactly. They held on to their own culture, their own identity.
They adapted.
They adapted. That's the key.
Yeah.
The Romans brought in their ideas about cities and government, but the Berbers, they blended it with their own traditions.
Interesting. So was there a lot of, Roman stuff built in Algeria?
Oh, absolutely. They built roads, cities, aqueducts. I mean, some of it's still standing today.
Really?
Yeah. Like Timgad. It's a Roman city. Up in the Urez Mountains, it's amazingly well preserved.
Wow, a Roman city in Algeria.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of the Roman impact, But the Roman Empire, it didn't last forever.
Of course not. Everything changes eventually. What happened in Algeria after Rome fell?
Well, it was a bit of a free-for-all for a while. You had the Vandals.
The Vandals, those are like the barbarian guys, right?
Yeah. They swept through North Africa in the 5th century. Didn't last long, but they made their mark. And then you had the Byzantines.
The Byzantines.
Yeah.
That was like the Eastern Roman Empire, right?
Exactly. They took control in the 6th century.
So Algeria had the Romans, then the Vandals, then the Byzantines. Wow, that's a lot of empires.
It is. But then there was a new force on the horizon, one that would completely change everything: Islam.
Okay, so this is where we see the arrival of Islam in North Africa. I bet that was a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't just a new religion, right? It brought a whole new culture with it. New laws, new social structures, even art and architecture.
A total transformation.
Exactly. And Arabic became the dominant language. You started seeing mosques popping up everywhere, like the Great Mosque of Algiers. It became a center of life for the community.
So how did the Berbers react to all this change? I mean, they had already dealt with the Romans and the Byzantines. Now they've got this new Arab Islamic culture coming in.
It was complicated. Some resisted. Some saw it as an opportunity. But over time, many Berbers converted to Islam.
So they adopted the new religion.
They did. But they didn't just abandon their own culture. They blended it with Islam. They adapted it to their own way of life.
Interesting. So it wasn't a complete takeover, more like a blending of cultures.
Exactly. And that blend, well, you can still see it in Algerian culture today.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we've got this new Islamic era in Algeria, but I know there were several powerful dynasties that emerged, right?
You're right. These weren't just Arab rulers either. They were Berbers who had embraced Islam and built their own empires. One of the first was the Rustamid dynasty.
Rustamid dynasty, okay. What were they known for?
Well, they were pretty tolerant rulers. They focused on scholarship and trade.
Sounds peaceful.
They had this flourishing capital city, Tahert. It was a center of learning and commerce. People came from all over.
Another ancient city lost to history. What happened to the Rustamids?
Well, they eventually fell victim to internal divisions and external pressures. In the 10th century, they were overthrown by the Fatimids.
The Fatimids, who were they?
They were a powerful Shia dynasty. They came from Tunisia and ended up conquering Egypt.
Wow, they were ambitious.
Very much so. They established a caliphate centered in Cairo.
So did Algeria become part of this Fatimid empire?
For a while, yes. But their grip on North Africa, well, it wasn't always strong. They had a lot of Berber groups who resisted them. And one of those groups, well, they were the Zirids.
The Zirids. Okay, another Berber group. Tell me about them.
They were a Sanhaja Berber clan.
Yeah.
They had been governors for the Fatimids in Ifriqiya.
Ifriqiya, that was what, like a region covering parts of modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya?
That's right. But as the Fatimids got weaker, the Zirids saw their chance.
And they broke away. Bold move.
It was, but it meant war. Conflicts with the Fatimids, other Berber groups, Arab tribes migrating into the region, you name it.
It sounds chaotic. Did the Zirids manage to hold on?
For a time. One of their leaders, Baloughan ibn Ziri, even conquered Fez.
Fez? In Morocco?
Yeah, most of Morocco, actually. This was in 980.
Wow, so they really expanded their territory.
They were ambitious, but expanding, well, it doesn't always equal stability. They ended up losing a lot of that territory.
Why was that?
Well, they had rebellions from other Berber factions. And then you had the Banu Hilal arriving on the scene.
The Banu Hilal. Now, weren't they those Arab Bedouin tribes that migrated across North Africa?
Right. And they weren't always the best neighbors.
What do you mean?
They were nomadic, right. So they often clashed with settled populations like the Zirids. It caused a lot of disruption.
Some more instability.
Basically, the Zirids couldn't hold it together. They lost a lot of their land.
It's like a constant cycle, isn't it? Dynasties rising and falling.
Yeah. And as the Zirids were declining, another Berber dynasty was emerging in central Algeria. The Hamidids.
The Hamidids. Okay, tell me about them.
Well, they actually came from within the Zirid state. Hamid ibn Blougan, he was a Zirid governor, but he rebelled.
Another rebellion. It seems like everyone was rebelling against someone.
It was a pretty turbulent time. So Hamid established his own kingdom in the early 11th century.
And were they successful?
They did pretty well for themselves. They controlled a big chunk of what's now Algeria.
Yeah.
And their capital city, Kalat Beni Hamid, it was this incredible fortified city.
It's impressive.
Oh, it was. It's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site now.
Wow. So they must have been pretty advanced.
They were. They were patrons of the arts and sciences. And they had a strong military, too.
So they were cultured and powerful.
Exactly. But like a lot of these dynasties, they eventually had problems.
What happened?
Conflicts with their neighbors, internal strife, The usual.
The never-ending power struggle.
Yeah, pretty much. They were weakened by conflicts with the Almoravids, another Berber dynasty, and those Hilalian Arab tribes were still causing problems.
Right, those guys. So the Hamidids eventually faded away too.
They did. And while all this was going on, another Berber dynasty was facing its own set of challenges in northwest Algeria. The Zayanids.
The Zayanids. Okay, another dynasty to keep track of.
Don't worry, we're almost through the dynasties.
Well, that's good to hear. So the Zayanids, what was their story?
They were also known as the Kingdom of Tlemcen, and they were in a tough spot, sandwiched between two powerful neighbors.
Who were they?
The Marinid Sultanate to the west and the Hafsid Sultanate to the east.
Oh, so they were constantly under pressure.
Exactly. Invasions, sieges, internal rebellions, you name it. There was this one time, the Marinid Sultan, Abu Yaqub Yusuf an-Nasr, he decided he wanted Tlemcen.
He wanted their capital.
Yep. So he laid siege to the city.
For how long?
8 years.
8 years. Wow. Talk about persistence.
And get this, he even built a whole new city nearby, Al-Mansura, just to divert trade and resources away from Tlemcen.
That's incredible. So what happened? Did he finally capture Tlemcen?
Well, we'll get to that. But first we have to talk about another player in this whole drama, the Spanish.
Oh, right. The Spanish were getting involved in North Africa around this time, weren't they?
They were. They had already conquered cities in Morocco and had their sights set on the Algerian coast.
What were they after?
Well, control of the Mediterranean, mainly. And they managed to capture some important cities: Oran, Algiers, Ujia.
So the Zayanids were facing pressure from both the Marinids and the Spanish.
Exactly. It was a tough time to be ruling in Tlemcen. And to make matters worse, a new power was emerging on the scene: the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans. Now, they were a force to be reckoned with. How did they get involved in Algeria?
Well, it's kind of ironic. Some Algerian factions actually invited them in to help fight the Spanish.
Oh, so they brought in the Ottomans as allies. That seems a bit like playing with fire.
It was, but that's what they did. And in the early 16th century, these two Ottoman brothers, Orus and Harridan Barbarossa, established themselves as powerful corsairs.
Barbarossa. Weren't those the famous pirate brothers?
Yep, the very same. They were operating with the backing of the Ottoman state, and they quickly gained control of Algiers and other coastal cities.
So they were like state-sanctioned pirates.
Pretty much. And Harridan, well, he became a legendary admiral. He helped expand Ottoman influence all across the Mediterranean.
So the Spanish invite the Ottomans in, and then the Ottomans basically take over. Talk about unintended consequences.
Exactly. The Ottomans became the dominant power in the region. They pushed back against the Spanish and established their own rule in Algeria. And, well, that's the beginning of the Regency of Algiers.
The Regency of Algiers. Okay, so we're entering a new era now. Tell me more about this regency. What was it like?
Well, it was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire.
So they still answered to the Sultan in Constantinople?
To a certain extent, yes. But they had a lot of autonomy. They were governed by Deys.
Deys? Who were they?
Rulers elected by a council of military and political elites. And Algiers, well, it became a major center of trade.
So they were doing well for themselves.
Oh, yeah. But it wasn't all legitimate trade. Algiers was also a base for the Barbary corsairs.
Ah, the Barbary corsairs, the pirates who terrorized European shipping.
Yep. They were a constant thorn in the side of European powers. Their raids disrupted trade, captured ships, and took people captive for ransom or, worse. Yeah. And that led to a lot of clashes with European navies.
So Algiers was this bustling port city with a mix of legitimate trade and, well, piracy. I bet it was a pretty wild place.
It was. And the Ottomans, well, they had a love-hate relationship with the corsairs.
What do you mean?
On one hand, they benefited from it. They got a cut of the loot.
Right, follow the money.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they had to deal with all the diplomatic fallout from the European powers who were understandably pretty upset about their ships being raided.
That makes sense. So it must have been a delicate balancing act for the Ottomans. Keep the Europeans happy, but also keep those corsairs bringing in the cash.
It was, and sometimes the Deys of Algiers, well, they would assert their independence, even defying the Sultan himself.
Really? They were that bold?
They were. There's this famous story about Dey Kur Abdi.
Kur Abdi, okay. What did he do?
So this Ottoman envoy shows up, right?
Representing the Sultan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he starts saying that the Sultan is the true king of Algiers.
Oh, I bet that didn't go over well.
Not at all. Kur Abdi supposedly shouted, "King of Algiers! King of Algiers! If he is the king of Algiers, then who am I?"
I love it. He was like, who do you think you're talking to?
Exactly. It just goes to show you how independent those days were. But the Regency of Algiers, well, it wouldn't last forever.
Of course not. What happened?
Well, a new power was on the rise, and they had their eyes on North Africa. France.
France. Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. The French invasion of Algeria, the colonization, the long struggle for independence.
You got it. And that's a story for another time.
Okay, so last time we left off with Algeria, under Ottoman rule,
Right.
they were this kind of mix of trade and piracy thanks to those Barbary corsairs. But things were about to change, weren't they?
Sip time. You see, while Algiers was doing its own thing, across the Mediterranean, you had France.
France, right. A major power on the rise.
And they wanted to, well, expand their empire. North Africa looked pretty good to them, and Algeria, well, it was right there, a prime target.
Strategically important.
Exactly. So you've got Algiers trying to play the Ottomans and the Europeans off each other, and then, bam, the French decide to invade.
But what was the trigger? I mean, what actually started the whole thing?
Well, it's this weird incident in 1827, the fly whisk incident, they call it.
Fly whisk incident. What, like a SWAT team with fly swatters?
No. It's even stranger than that. So you've got the Dey of Algiers, Hussein Dey, right? He's in this meeting with the French consul.
Okay.
And they're arguing about unpaid debts.
Dead set.
Yeah, Algeria owed France money. And things get heated, And the Dey, well, he loses his temper and hits the consul with a fly whisk.
A fly whisk? Seriously, that's what started a war.
It sounds crazy now, right? But back then, it was a huge insult, a diplomatic no-no. And France, well, they were already looking for an excuse to invade.
So a fly whisk becomes a casus belli.
You got it. France saw Algeria as, well, a pretty valuable prize. Raw materials, a market for their goods, a strategic foothold in the Mediterranean. They wanted it all.
I see. So Algeria goes from this pirate haven to a colonial target. What did the Algerians think about all this? Did they just roll over?
Some did, especially in the coastal areas. But as the French pushed inland, they met a lot of resistance.
They ran into some resistance fighters.
Yeah. Algerian tribes, local leaders, they weren't going to just give up their land without a fight.
Right. This is where we see guys like Emir Abdelkader, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was like the Algerian George Washington.
He was a brilliant leader, a military strategist, a scholar, a real unifier. He brought different Algerian tribes together to resist the French.
A true hero. So what did he do?
Well, for over a decade, he waged this guerrilla war against the French, from 1832 to 1847.
Wow. 15 years. That's a long time.
He knew the terrain. He was a master of hit-and-run tactics. He made life very difficult for the French.
Smart. So he's fighting this war, but he's also, trying to build a nation?
Yeah. He established a short-lived independent state, the Emirate of Abdelkader. It had its own government, laws, even a postal service.
He was thinking ahead. But I'm guessing things didn't end well for him.
Sadly, no. The French had too much firepower, too many resources. He was forced to surrender in 1847.
That's sad. What happened to him?
They exiled him to France. He spent the rest of his life there.
The tragic end. But I bet his story inspired a lot of Algerians.
Oh, absolutely. He became a symbol of resistance. But even after he was gone, the fighting didn't stop.
So the French didn't exactly have an easy time, even after they defeated Abdelkader.
No, not at all. They faced resistance for decades. Uprisings, rebellions, it was brutal. It took them a long time to really pacify Algeria.
And I imagine the French didn't handle the resistance very gently.
Not really. They used scorched earth policies, destroyed villages, crops, anything to punish rebellious tribes.
That's harsh.
And they'd force people into camps, too, trying to break up communities, cut off support for the resistance.
The classic colonial tactic. Control the people, control the land.
Exactly. They also tried to assimilate Algerians into French culture.
Make them more French.
Yeah. They tried to suppress Arabic and Berber languages, push French education. They wanted to make Algeria more like France.
But did it work? Did Algerians just abandon their own culture?
Not completely. French culture definitely had an influence, especially in the cities. But many Algerians held on to their own traditions.
So they resisted assimilation.
They did. And ironically, that resistance, well, it actually helped to create Algerian nationalism.
How so?
Well, the shared experience of oppression, right? The exploitation, the cultural suppression, it brought Algerians together.
It gave them a common enemy, a common cause.
Exactly. They started seeing themselves as one people, united against French rule.
So the seeds of independence were sown during the colonial period itself.
You could say that. But it was a long process. It took decades of activism, organizing, and eventually armed struggle before Algeria finally gained its independence in 1962.
A long and difficult road. And that struggle for independence, the Algerian War, it was particularly brutal, wasn't it?
It was. It lasted from 1954 to 1962. And it was a very dark chapter in both Algerian and French history.
So who were the main players on the Algerian side?
The National Liberation Front, or FLN. They were the driving force behind the independence movement.
Okay. And what was their strategy? How did they fight the French?
Well, they were very organized, very determined. They used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, bombings. They wanted to make the war as costly as possible for the French.
Make them bleed.
Yeah. And they weren't afraid to target French settlers, too. Anyone seen as collaborating with the French was a target.
And how did the French respond to this?
Brutally. Torture, mass arrests, executions. They weren't messing around. And they used those forced relocation tactics again, too, trying to cut off support for the FLN.
A brutal war. A war of attrition.
Exactly. It took a toll on both sides. Hundreds of thousands of people died.
A terrible price to pay for freedom. And this war, it had an impact on France, too, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. It divided French society, caused political instability. It even contributed to the collapse of their government, the Fourth Republic.
Wow. So it wasn't just a distant colonial conflict. It had real consequences back in France.
It forced them to confront their colonial past, their own ideals. It changed how they saw themselves. And it had a big impact on French attitudes toward immigration, too.
So a pivotal moment in both Algerian and French history.
Okay.
But how did the war finally end?
After years of fighting and negotiating, they finally signed a ceasefire agreement in 1962, the Evian Accords.
The Evian Accords.
Yeah. And that led to Algerian independence. It was officially declared on July 5, 1962.
After over a century of French rule, Algeria was finally free. But I imagine independence came with its own set of challenges.
Absolutely. I mean, the country was devastated by war. The economy was in shambles. There was poverty, unemployment. And then you had the mass exodus of the Pieds Noirs.
The Pieds Noirs. Who were they?
The European settlers, the ones who had been running things in Algeria for generations.
Right.
And when Algeria became independent, many of them, well, they left, went back to France or other parts of Europe.
So Algeria lost a lot of its experienced workforce and administrators.
Exactly. It created a huge void. And it meant that independent Algeria had to start almost from scratch.
Rebuild everything.
Yep. It was a daunting task. And in this new independent Algeria, a new leader emerged, Ahmed Ben Bella.
Ben Bella, the first president of independent Algeria. What was his vision for the country?
He was a socialist. He wanted Algeria to be this non-aligned nation, independent in its foreign policy.
Yeah.
He focused on social justice, economic development. He nationalized a lot of industries, redistributed land. He was trying to create a more equal society.
A pretty radical change from the colonial era.
It was. And he also wanted Algeria to be a leader in the developing world. He forged ties with other newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. He saw Algeria as a symbol of anti-colonialism.
A beacon of hope.
Yeah. But sadly, things didn't go as planned. Ben Bella faced a lot of challenges. His policies alienated some powerful people, there were economic problems, and in 1965, he was overthrown in a coup.
Another coup. Seems like a recurring theme. Who took over?
Houari Boumediene, Ben Bella's defense minister.
So what was he like?
He was a military man, more pragmatic than Ben Bella, more authoritarian too. He consolidated power, strengthened the army, and focused on state-led economic development.
So less idealism, more pragmatism.
Yeah. He pushed industrialization, nationalized even more of the economy, invested in infrastructure. He also did some good things for education and healthcare. He wanted to improve people's lives.
So he's a complex figure.
Very much so. He brought stability, but also repression. Some people see him as a modernizer, others as a dictator.
A mixed legacy. What happened after Boumediene?
Well, he died in 1978, and that led to some instability. His successor, Chadli Benjedid, tried to reform things, but he ran into problems. Social unrest, economic woes, and then a new force emerged on the scene: Islamism.
Islamism, the rise of religious political movements. How did that impact Algeria?
It's a complicated story. You had social and economic grievances, people were disillusioned with the government, and there was this desire for a a more morally grounded political system.
So a perfect storm for religious politics.
In a way, yes. The government tried to accommodate these Islamist groups at first, gave them some political space.
Okay.
But as the Islamists gained popularity, the government cracked down, things got tense.
And that tension, it eventually led to the Algerian Civil War, didn't it?
It did. It started in 1991 and lasted for almost a decade. A brutal conflict. Hundreds of thousands of people died.
A horrific tragedy.
It left deep scars on Algerian society. And the legacy of that war, well, it's still felt today.
Wow, what a journey we've been on. We've covered ancient empires, the arrival of Islam, French colonialism, the struggle for independence, and now this brutal civil war.
And that brings us to the 21st century.
Last time, we left off with Algeria emerging from that really devastating civil war.
Mm-hmm.
What happened next? Like, how do you even begin to rebuild after something like that?
It was a long process. I mean, the wounds were still very raw in the early 2000s. But under President Bouteflika, they started this national reconciliation policy.
National reconciliation. That sounds, ambitious. What did it involve?
Basically, they were trying to reintegrate former insurgents back into society, offering amnesty, trying to promote forgiveness and all that.
I see. So trying to heal those divisions. Did it work?
It's hard to say. I mean, some people embraced it. They saw it as the only way to move forward, to have lasting peace.
Right.
But others, well, they felt like justice hadn't been served, that the people who committed atrocities should be held accountable.
I can see that. It's a tough situation. So reconciliation was, a mixed bag. What about the political system? Did things become more democratic after the war?
There were some attempts at reform, but the FLN, they were still the dominant party.
The same party that had ruled since independence.
Right. And the military, well, they still had a lot of influence.
Behind the scenes.
Exactly. Bouteflika, he won several elections, but there were always accusations of fraud.
So not exactly a shining example of democracy.
No, really. It was more like managed democracy.
I see. And what about the economy? Did things improve after the war?
Algeria has a lot of oil and gas, right?
Right.
So they make a lot of money from that, but it also makes them dependent on energy prices.
The classic resource curse.
Exactly. They've been trying to diversify for years, but it's slow going.
Why is that?
Well, you've got bureaucracy, corruption, not enough skilled labor. It's hard for small businesses to get started.
Sounds like a lot of obstacles. So economically, things were still pretty shaky.
Yeah. And then socially, you have this really diverse society.
In what way?
Well, you've got different ethnic groups, different languages. Arabic's the official language, but a lot of people speak Berber languages too, especially in the Kabylie region. And then religiously, most people are Muslim, but there are some Christians and Jews too.
So a real mix of cultures and religions. Did that cause any problems?
There have been some tensions, yeah. Especially between Arabs and Berbers. The Berbers, they've been pushing for more recognition of their language and culture.
They want their rights recognized.
Exactly. Back in the 80s, there was this big movement, the Berber Spring. They were demanding more rights.
Interesting. So even within a majority Muslim country, you have these struggles for cultural identity. And then into all of this, you have the Arab Spring.
Yeah, 2011. That was a big deal. Uprisings all across the Arab world.
Did it affect Algeria?
Oh, definitely. People were inspired by what was happening in other countries. They started protesting, demanding change.
So the Arab Spring had a ripple effect. How did the Algerian government react?
They tried to, control things, increased social spending, promised some reforms, but also cracked down on dissent. Bouteflika, he was already pretty sick by this point, but they reelected him in 2014.
For a fourth term.
Yep. But he was barely seen in public after that.
It sounds like they were trying to just keep a lid on things. Did it work?
Not really. I mean, the underlying problems, corruption, inequality, lack of political freedom, all of that was still there. And in 2019, it all boiled over.
This is the Hirak Movement, right?
Exactly. It was this huge protest movement, people from all walks of life demanding real change.
What were they asking for?
An end to corruption, a new political system, real democracy. They wanted to get rid of the old guard, the whole system.
So a real grassroots revolution.
Pretty much. And it worked. Bouteflika was forced to resign in April 2019.
Wow. People power. So what happened after Bouteflika stepped down?
New elections. Abdelmajid Tebboune, he became president in December 2019.
Okay. And did things settle down after that?
Not entirely. The Hirak, they kept pushing for more reforms, more accountability.
So the struggle continues. What about the other issues? The economy, the Berber question, the military's role?
Still a work in progress. They've made some economic reforms, but diversification's tough. The pandemic didn't help. And the Berbers are still fighting for their rights.
So a lot of challenges still ahead. But is there hope for Algeria? After everything they've been through?
I think so. The Hirak showed that people are engaged, that they want a better future.
That's a good sign. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today. From ancient kingdoms to revolution, from colonialism to the struggle for democracy.
Algeria's history, it's a reminder that even in the face of incredible challenges, the human spirit, it endures.
And the fight for freedom, for a better life, it never really ends. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next time.